It was a crisp autumn afternoon in the park, the kind where the sun still held a bit of warmth in the air, but the breeze carried the promise of the coming cold. Families gathered on the grass, kids running around, the distant sound of laughter mixing with the rustling of the trees. Everything seemed normal, peaceful, until the atmosphere shifted, subtly at first, like a storm cloud creeping over the horizon. A woman, walking her dog along the path, glanced at the group in the distance, a black family enjoying the day together, their kids playing, their laughter filling the space. For some, it would have been a picture of everyday life, nothing out of the ordinary. But for her, something snapped. Maybe it was an old prejudice, something that had festered for years, lurking just below the surface, waiting for the wrong moment to erupt. Or maybe it was the unease she felt seeing people who didn't look like her living their lives so freely, so comfortably. Whatever it was enough. She stopped walking. Her dog tugged at the leash, unaware of the growing tension in the air. The woman stood there for a moment, eyes narrowing as she watched the family, her face tightening into a scowl. Something had ignited within her, a need to make a point, to assert her control over a situation that, in her mind, seemed out of place. She was about to make a decision that would change everything. Without thinking, she started moving toward them, her footsteps sharp against the gravel path. It was like watching a car heading straight for a wall. You could feel the collision coming, but there was nothing you could do to stop it. As she approached, she opened her mouth, and the words that came out of her were filled with hostility, an angry tirade that seemed to come from nowhere. It was as if she was daring them to respond, daring them to challenge her authority. The family, caught off guard by her sudden outburst, froze for a moment, unsure of how to react. The mother of the family stood up first, her body tensing, ready to protect her children if necessary. But she didn't respond with the same aggression the woman had brought to the table. Instead, she simply asked, "What's the problem?" Her voice was calm, measured, not the kind of reaction the woman was expecting. The woman's eyes flickered with confusion, unsure of how to handle someone who wasn't backing down, someone who wasn't scared. The scene quickly escalated, the words becoming sharper, the tension building with every exchange. It wasn't just a confrontation between two people, it was a clash of worlds, of ideologies, of everything the woman had been carrying inside her for years. And the more the mother stood her ground, the more the woman's anger seemed to spiral out of control. But just as quickly as the storm had come, something unexpected happened. The woman's face softened. The fire that had driven her forward suddenly seemed to flicker and die out. It was as if the weight of her words had hit her all at once, and she was left standing there, exposed, vulnerable. The crowd that had gathered around them, some of whom had been watching in disbelief, murmured among themselves, sensing the shift. The woman, who had come to instigate a fight, now stood motionless, her mind racing. Was she realizing something about herself? About the anger that had propelled her toward this moment? Or was she simply trying to figure out how to save face? The family, still unsure of what had just unfolded, exchanged looks with each other, sensing the change but unsure if it was genuine. They hadn't expected an apology, but the sudden shift in the woman's demeanor left them in a strange sort of limbo. Would she walk away, defeated, or would she double down on her harsh words? The silence stretched, filled with unspoken questions. But the woman didn't speak. She didn't make any grand gestures or try to explain herself. She simply turned and walked away, her dog tugging at the leash once more. The family watched her leave, still in shock over the strange encounter. But as they turned back to each other, there was a sense of unease in the air, a lingering tension that no one could shake off. What had just happened? Was that truly regret in the woman's eyes, or was she just retreating, hoping to forget the mess she had made? In that moment, it was clear that something had changed not just for the woman, but for everyone who had witnessed it. No one would forget the day when the air had thickened with anger, when words had flown like daggers, and when, for just a brief moment, regret hung heavy in the air. But what would happen next? Would the woman reflect on her actions, or would she continue down the path of hatred and misunderstanding? Would the family feel safe again, or would this moment forever alter the way they viewed the world around them? As the park slowly returned to its peaceful state, the questions lingered, unanswered. And so, the story doesn't end here. The woman may have walked away, but the real story, what happens after regret sets in, after the anger fades and the weight of the confrontation settles in, has yet to unfold. The woman walked briskly, her head down, her thoughts racing in every direction. Her grip tightened around the leash, her dog tugging impatiently as if unaware of the storm that had just passed between its owner and the family in the park. She tried to calm herself, but the anger still churned inside her, mixing with a strange sense of confusion, regret, and something else she couldn't quite identify. She had said those things, those hateful things, without even thinking. And yet there was something about the way the mother had responded, calm, poised, unaffected, that lingered in her mind. As she walked further from the park, the weight of the encounter pressed down on her chest. What had she hoped to achieve with those words? Had she really believed they would make her feel better? That somehow, by asserting herself in such an ugly way, she would regain control over a situation that she never truly controlled to begin with? The realization hit her like a punch in the gut. Her behavior was driven by something deeper, something that had been buried under the surface for years. She had grown up in a community where everyone looked like her, where differences were often seen as a threat, something to be feared. It wasn't a place where people spoke openly about racism, it was more of an unspoken rule, an invisible line drawn between those who were like us and those who were different. It wasn't until she left home, moved to the city, and encountered the diversity she had been sheltered from that she began to feel a discomfort, an unease she couldn't shake. The world was changing, and she wasn't sure how to handle it. It had been a slow process, this shifting of her worldview, but over the years, the resentment had built up, an undercurrent that she tried to ignore. It wasn't just about race, it was about everything. Her life hadn't turned out the way she expected. She had failed in some ways, and instead of facing those failures head on, she had found it easier to blame others. And now, standing in the aftermath of that confrontation, she realized that a small part of her had always believed that she was entitled to something. That the world, in all its complexity, was somehow supposed to bend to her expectations. But she had been wrong. And in the silence of her walk, she started to see that. Back at the park, the family remained seated, the weight of the moment still hanging in the air. The kids, confused by what had just happened, kept glancing toward their mother, searching for reassurance. She smiled at them, a soft, reassuring smile, but inside she was troubled. She had seen the woman's face as she had turned away, the flash of something in her eyes. It hadn't been anger, at least not entirely. It had been something else, a flicker of doubt, maybe, or even a moment of self-awareness. The mother had seen it, too. And in that instant, something deep inside her had stirred. She had been angry at first, the words cutting through her like sharp knives, but she had stayed calm. She had stayed in control. It wasn't always easy, especially when her children were involved. But this woman, this stranger, had caught her off guard, and she wasn't sure how to feel about the way the confrontation had ended. It was too abrupt, too unresolved. She glanced at her children, who were still sitting on the grass, their faces uncertain. The younger one had started playing with a stick, trying to shake off the tension, while the older ones seemed lost in thought. They didn't understand fully what had just happened, but they felt it. Kids always did. They could sense the change in the air, even if they didn't know how to name it. She didn't want to say anything yet. She needed time to process. Her mind kept replaying the scene, the woman's words, her sudden retreat, and the silence that had followed. What did it all mean? Was this some kind of lesson? A reminder that even in moments of cruelty, there could be the possibility of change? Or was it simply an incident, nothing more than a strange and uncomfortable encounter that would fade into the background of her life? She wasn't sure. But the questions lingered, refusing to go away. The rest of the day passed slowly, the park gradually emptying as families packed up to go home. The once vibrant place began to feel emptier, quieter, as if the encounter had left a scar on the otherwise peaceful setting. The woman didn't look back. She simply walked away, her dog pulling her along, her footsteps quick and determined, but her heart heavy with something she didn't yet understand. When she got home, she stood in the doorway for a moment, staring at the familiar surroundings. The walls of her apartment were the same, the worn furniture, and the scent of old books and coffee still filling the air. It should have been comforting, but today it felt different. The silence of her apartment seemed to echo with the weight of her actions, a constant reminder of what had happened earlier. She took off her coat, hung it up, and sat down at the kitchen table. The words the family had spoken to her replayed in her mind over and over again. The mother's calmness, the way she had stood up to her without even raising her voice. The woman couldn't shake the feeling that she had miscalculated somehow. She had expected to feel some sense of victory after confronting them, but instead, she felt nothing. Worse, she felt exposed, like the mask she had worn for so long had slipped, and now she was staring at herself in the mirror, unsure of who she was or who she had become. She hadn't been ready for that. The evening dragged on, but sleep didn't come easily. The encounter had stirred something deep inside her, something she hadn't wanted to face. The idea of regret gnawed at her, but it wasn't just regret for the words she had said. It was something more profound, more unsettling. She didn't know if she could undo what had been done, but something told her that this moment, this strange and uncomfortable moment, would stay with her for a long time. And the family? They, too, were left to wrestle with their own thoughts. The next morning, the mother stood by the window, watching the world outside. It was a peaceful day, but the events of yesterday still lingered. She couldn't help but wonder what would happen if they crossed paths with that woman again. Would she apologize? Would she explain herself? Or would she avoid them entirely, pretending nothing had ever happened? The questions weren't easy to answer. The family had their own struggles, their own challenges, but moments like this, moments that pushed the boundaries of understanding, were rare. And in a way, it was impossible to simply forget it. No matter how much they tried to shake it off, the tension remained, hanging in the air, waiting to be resolved. Neither the woman nor the family could know it yet, but the encounter in the park had set in motion a series of events that would change everything. What would the woman do next? Would she confront her own feelings, or would she bury them, allowing her prejudice to continue festering? And what about the family? How would they respond to the lingering unease? There were so many unknowns, so many unanswered questions. But for now, all they could do was wait. And in that waiting, the suspense only grew. Days passed, but the unsettling memory of that afternoon in the park clung to both the woman and the family, lingering in the quiet spaces of their lives. It wasn't something that could easily be shaken off. For the woman, it felt as though she had opened a door to something she wasn't ready to face, and now the echoes of what had happened were reverberating through her mind. For the family, it was a reminder that the world they lived in wasn't as safe as they had hoped, that there were forces beyond their control that could disrupt their peace at any moment. Neither knew it yet, but their paths were destined to cross again. The woman's name was rarely spoken aloud, but in the confines of her apartment, where the walls seemed to close in on her, it echoed in her mind. She couldn't stop replaying the scene over and over. What had driven her to act the way she did? What had she hoped to achieve with such venom? She had always prided herself on being someone who didn't back down from confrontation, but this felt different. There had been a vulnerability in her actions, a rawness she hadn't expected. And the worst part was that it wasn't the confrontation that haunted her, it was the regret that followed. She didn't understand it. How could she feel sorry for something that had felt so right in the moment? The anger had been justified, hadn't it? After all, who were they to take up space, to live their lives so freely, without regard for people like her, who had to navigate this shifting world alone? But then, she thought of the mother's calm demeanor. She had stood tall, unwavering, like someone who had seen it all before and wasn't intimidated by the harsh words of strangers. That woman wasn't afraid of her. And that, in itself, was a strange sort of power. One that made her question her own sense of control. What did it mean to be in control, she wondered. For so long, she had believed that power came from asserting dominance, from making others feel small. But that moment in the park when the mother had merely asked her what the problem was had cracked that illusion wide open. It wasn't about power. It was about fear. Fear that she wasn't enough, that the world around her was slipping through her fingers, and she couldn't stop it. It was about being confronted by someone who didn't flinch, someone who didn't let her words rattle them. Back in the park, the family had slowly started to return to their routine, though something had changed. The mother could feel the shift in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. Her children, who had been oblivious to much of the tension the day before, seemed to sense it, too. They were quieter, more cautious as they went about their day, their eyes darting to strangers with an unfamiliar wariness. The younger one asked if they could go to another park next time, a question that tugged at the mother's heart. She had promised them that they would be safe, that they could be free, but moments like the one they had just experienced made her question the truth of those promises. She had always known that the world could be harsh, that prejudice was something they would eventually encounter, but this was different. This wasn't just about an isolated incident, it was about something bigger, something insidious. It was a reminder that, no matter how hard they tried to ignore it, there would always be people like the woman in the park, people who carried their anger, their fear, into every space they occupied. And sometimes, they weren't content to keep it to themselves. Sometimes, they would let it spill over and drag everyone else into their mess. She couldn't help but think about what had happened when the woman had walked away, her face suddenly blank, her words gone. There had been something in her eyes, something that made the mother hesitate. Was it guilt? Regret? Or was it just a fleeting moment of realization that she had lost control of the situation? Whatever it was, it made the mother uneasy. She didn't want to think too much about it, but it was hard not to. As the days wore on, the family's unease grew. They had begun to see the world differently, through a lens that was sharper, more aware of the subtle ways people treated them. They noticed the stares, the whispers, the way some people avoided making eye contact when they passed by. It wasn't overt, but it was there, just beneath the surface, like a shadow that followed them wherever they went. The mother tried to shield her children from it as best she could, but it was becoming harder to do so. How could she protect them from something that was invisible, that no one talked about directly, but that everyone seemed to understand? The woman, meanwhile, was starting to notice the same things. As much as she tried to bury the feelings that had surfaced after the park encounter, they kept bubbling to the surface. She saw it now in the eyes of the people around her, the way they looked at her, the way they stepped aside as she walked past, as if they could sense the anger she carried. It was a strange feeling, like she was suddenly out of place in her own skin. She had never thought about how others perceived her before, never questioned the assumptions they made when they looked at her. But now, the weight of it seemed unbearable. She was being watched. People were seeing her for who she really was, not the version of herself she had carefully curated. And it scared her. One afternoon, she found herself walking through the same park again, though she hadn't planned on it. It was as though her feet had carried her there on their own, pulling her back to the place where everything had changed. She stopped at the edge of the field, watching as families enjoyed the sunny afternoon, completely unaware of the storm that had just passed through their world. She felt a strange pull, a desire to go back, to apologize, to say something to the family. But what could she say? Could a few words really undo the harm she had caused? Would they even accept her apology? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sight of a familiar face. It was the mother, walking with her children across the park, seemingly carefree, as if nothing had happened. The woman's heart skipped a beat. She was so close to the family again, and yet she felt paralyzed. What was she supposed to do? Should she confront them, explain herself? Or should she walk away, pretend it had never happened? But before she could make up her mind, the mother turned, her eyes locking onto the woman's. For a moment, the world seemed to slow, as if time itself was holding its breath. The woman's stomach churned. She could feel her body tense, her palms growing clammy. The tension between them was palpable, the unspoken questions hanging in the air like thick smoke. And then, just as quickly, the moment passed. The mother looked away, guiding her children toward the playground, her face unreadable. The woman stood there for a long moment, watching them go. She hadn't expected anything to change, but the encounter left her feeling more confused than ever. Was this the beginning of something? Or was it just another moment of avoidance, a way to pretend that nothing had happened, that everything was fine? The question gnawed at her, keeping her awake at night, refusing to let her move on. The tension remained, unresolved, hanging in the air like a storm cloud, waiting for the right moment to break. The days that followed felt like they were dragging on, each one heavier than the last. The woman couldn't shake the feeling of something unfinished, like an itch she couldn't reach, a knot in her stomach that wouldn't go away. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the mother's face in the park, calm and composed, her eyes betraying no hint of anger, no sign of fear. It was as though she had stood in front of the woman and simply refused to be moved. And that made the woman uneasy. She didn't know what to do with the silence that followed, or how to make sense of the shame that had crept in after the encounter. She tried to keep herself busy, to push it all down, but every little thing seemed to remind her of that moment. The sound of children laughing, the sight of families walking through the park, the way people smiled at each other as if the world was a peaceful place. It grated against her, a reminder of what she had done and how it had torn open a wound she didn't even know existed. She had always thought of herself as someone who knew where they stood, someone who understood the world and knew how to handle it. But now, nothing made sense anymore. Back at the park, the family felt it too. There was a tension that hung in the air, the weight of what had happened seeping into every conversation, every glance. The mother tried to keep things normal for the sake of her children, but the unease was too strong. She had been expecting anything to follow that confrontation, some form of closure, but the days passed, and the silence was deafening. It was almost as if the woman had never existed, like the whole thing had been a strange, inexplicable blip in their lives. But there was something else gnawing at her, something she couldn't ignore. She couldn't get that moment out of her head. When their eyes had met, there had been something there, a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Was it fear? Was it regret? Or was it just the briefest flash of vulnerability, a moment when the woman saw herself for what she truly was? She had felt it, too, that moment of uncertainty, but it had been so brief. She couldn't decide whether she wanted to believe it was real or whether it had just been a figment of her imagination, a trick of the mind. But the truth was, she hadn't been able to stop thinking about it either. The family, especially the mother, had somehow gotten under her skin, made her question everything she thought she knew. And now, as she sat alone in her apartment, the thoughts spiraled out of control. What if they were right? What if everything she had believed in was wrong? What if there was another way, another possibility that she had never even considered? It was a cold evening when the tension finally came to a head. The woman, restless and unable to find peace, found herself walking back to the park again. She didn't know why she was drawn there, only that something inside her needed to be there, as if the park itself held the answers to the questions that had been gnawing at her. She walked the familiar path, her footsteps echoing in the quiet evening. The world around her was slowing down, the last vestiges of sunlight fading into twilight. As she reached the same open area where the confrontation had happened, she froze. There they were again, the family. The mother, her children playing in the grass, completely unaware of the woman's presence. The mother looked different, somehow more relaxed, at ease, her laughter rising in the air like a song. It should have felt like a relief, seeing them in this peaceful moment, but instead, the woman felt a pang of something sharp and uncomfortable. Was it jealousy? Was it guilt? She couldn't quite name it, but it pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. For a long moment, she stood there, watching them from the shadows, unsure of what to do. She didn't know if she was ready to face the consequences of her actions, to hear the words she knew would come. But there was something inside her, something that had been building for days, pushing her forward. Maybe it was the thought that she needed to make things right, to explain herself, to somehow find redemption for what she had done. She took a tentative step forward, and then another, until she was standing just outside the family's circle. Her heart was pounding now, her palms sweating, but she couldn't stop herself. The woman opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out at first. The tension in her body was so tight it felt as if she might snap. It wasn't until the mother looked up and saw her standing there, hovering on the edge of the group, that the woman felt something shift. The mother's gaze didn't flicker with surprise or fear. It was calm, steady, as if she had been expecting this moment all along. For a split second, the woman thought she might turn away, leave her standing there in awkward silence. But instead, the mother stood up slowly, her movements measured, not hurried, as if she were deciding whether to trust the woman in front of her. The children, sensing the shift in the air, had stopped playing and were now looking at the woman, their faces curious but cautious. The woman couldn't tear her eyes away from the mother, whose expression was unreadable. The silence between them was thick, stretching longer than either of them had expected. The woman opened her mouth again, this time with more determination. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice low but clear. The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded. It felt like an apology, but at the same time, it felt like so much more. She wasn't sure if she was apologizing for the words she had said, for the anger she had unleashed, or for something deeper, something she couldn't yet name. She wasn't even sure if the mother would accept it. But she had to say it. The mother didn't speak at first, just stood there, eyes locked onto the woman. It was almost like she was waiting for something more, something beyond the words. The children were still watching, the silence between them all growing more unbearable with each passing second. Finally, the mother took a step forward, her gaze softening, but her words were measured. "Why?" she asked simply. The question was direct, but it wasn't harsh. It was genuine, as though she really wanted to understand why the woman had acted the way she had. The woman felt her breath catch in her throat. She had expected anger, maybe a few harsh words, but not this. She had braced herself for the weight of judgment, but instead, the question was disarming, pulling her into a space where everything she had been carrying was suddenly laid bare. Why? She had no easy answer. No simple justification. All she could do was stand there, feeling the weight of the question pressing down on her, knowing that the truth was something she had yet to face. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the woman's answer. The woman stood frozen, caught in the weight of the mother's simple question. Why? It was a question that rattled her, pierced through all the justifications she had built for herself, and left her feeling exposed. She opened her mouth, but words didn't come. The truth felt like a heavy stone lodged in her throat, one she couldn't quite swallow. For a moment, the mother's gaze softened, her eyes reading the woman as though she could see the internal battle raging inside her. The woman expected her to say something more, something like "I understand" or "it's okay," But the mother remained silent, her face neutral yet unwavering. Her presence was calm, almost serene, but it felt like a challenge. The silence stretched on, taut and unyielding. And then, just as the woman felt she might crumble under the weight of her own uncertainty, something unexpected happened. The air around them seemed to change, like the entire park held its breath, waiting for something to break. A voice from the distance called out, sharp and accusing. "What are you doing here?" The woman's head snapped around, startled by the sudden interruption. Her eyes landed on a figure emerging from the shadows at the edge of the park, a man. His expression was intense, his eyes hard with suspicion. He was walking quickly toward them, his gait purposeful, his steps almost as if he had been watching from a distance, waiting for the right moment to step in. The mother's expression shifted, a flicker of concern crossing her face. Her body tensed as she turned to face the newcomer. The children instinctively took a few steps back, huddling closer to their mother. "Who are you?" the woman asked, her voice trembling with a mix of confusion and rising fear. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he sized up the situation with a glance, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the woman standing there. For a brief moment, it seemed like he was waiting for something, a signal, a cue, but then he spoke, his voice carrying an edge. "This is none of your business," he said, his tone directed at the woman, but his eyes were on the mother now. The mother stepped forward slightly, her body positioning itself between her children and the stranger. There was a subtle shift in her demeanor, like she was no longer just concerned about the woman who had caused the disturbance earlier but was now facing a different threat. The change was swift, and the woman noticed it immediately. Something had shifted. "Who are you?" the woman repeated, now brimming with an edge of frustration. "What do you want?" The man didn't immediately answer her. Instead, he moved closer, standing just a few feet away from the family, his gaze never wavering from the mother. "I've been watching," he finally said, his voice low and dangerous, but also laden with something darker and underlying accusation. "I've seen you both before." The mother's face tightened. The shift in her expression was subtle, but the woman saw it. A flicker of recognition? Fear? There was something in her eyes now that made the woman's heart race with dread. The children, sensing the change, looked up at their mother, their faces confused but clearly worried. "What are you talking about?" the mother asked, her voice a little more forceful now. But there was a wariness there, a sense of discomfort that didn't escape the woman's notice. The park, once a place of peace, had become a battlefield of hidden tensions and unspoken history. "I know you," the man said, this time his words more pointed, almost accusing. "And I know who she is." His eyes shifted toward the woman, and she felt a chill crawl up her spine. She had no idea who this man was or why he was suddenly involved, but there was something deeply unsettling about the way he spoke. The woman's pulse quickened, and she instinctively took a step back. She could feel the tension rising in the air, like a storm that was about to break. Who was this man? And why did he say he knew her? Did he know about what had happened in the park? Was he connected to the woman somehow, or was he just another stranger who had crossed paths with them? The man didn't give her time to process the thought. He turned back to the mother, his tone now darker. "You thought you could just walk away from this, didn't you?" he said. "That you could leave it all behind, but it's not that simple." The mother's eyes flashed with something the woman couldn't quite place: guilt. Fear? It was all so fast, so sudden, that the woman was struggling to keep up with the rapid shifts. She was now watching, not just the family, but also this stranger who seemed to know more than he was letting on. "Leave us alone," the mother said, her voice trembling slightly but holding firm. "You have no right to be here." But the man didn't back down. Instead, he took another step forward, his gaze growing colder with each passing second. "I have every right," he said quietly, with a sharpness that sent a wave of unease through the woman. And you know it. The woman's mind raced. What did he mean? What was this strange connection between him and the family? And why did he seem so insistent on pushing the boundaries now, when everything had felt so tenuous before? Before she could ask anything else, the man turned his eyes back to her, and for the first time, she felt the full weight of his gaze. "You're not done yet," he said, the words sharp and final, almost like a command. "There's more to this than you know." The woman's stomach twisted in knots. She had been standing on the edge of something she hadn't fully understood, and now she was being dragged deeper into it, pulled into a conflict she didn't even know existed. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of what had just happened. Who was this man? What was his connection to the family? What was he talking about? The mother, her face now a mask of determination, took a step toward the stranger. "Get out of here," she said, her voice unwavering. But there was something different now. Something in her eyes suggested she had been here before, that this was not the first time she had faced someone like him. The tension crackled between them like static, a storm of secrets and old grudges building, threatening to explode. The woman stood there, torn between fear and confusion, caught between two people who seemed to know each other better than she could ever understand. And then, as if to seal the moment, the man said something that would shatter everything the woman thought she knew. "You don't even know who you're up against," he muttered, his voice lowering to a near whisper, but carrying enough weight to send a chill down her spine. The words hung in the air, unanswered, leaving more questions than they resolved, as the woman's world seemed to tilt on its axis. The air felt thick with tension, as though the weight of the man's words had created an invisible force, pressing in on everyone. The woman's heart raced, the confusion and fear clouding her thoughts. The mother stood her ground, but the woman could see the tiny tremor in her hands, the subtle shift in her stance that spoke volumes. She was on edge, no matter how much she tried to conceal it. The man's words had sent a ripple of unease through the woman, but it wasn't until the mother stepped forward once more that something in the air shifted. The woman noticed it first, a shift in the mother's eyes. There was something colder there now, something that hadn't been there before. She wasn't just defending her family anymore. She was preparing for something far bigger. "You've been lying," the mother said quietly, her voice so calm it was almost eerie. The words hung between them, and the woman's stomach twisted. The man faltered for just a split second, but it was enough. He hadn't expected her to speak so directly. The woman felt her pulse quicken, unsure of where this was going, but feeling the weight of each passing second. "You think you can just erase the past," the mother continued, her voice growing firmer with each word. "But you can't. Not anymore." The man's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Instead, he took a step back, his posture tense. The woman could feel something coming, something that had been brewing beneath the surface for a long time, and now it was rising, ready to break. "You don't get it," the man finally said, his voice strained with anger. "You have no idea what you're really up against. You don't know who I am." The woman's mind raced. She could feel the walls closing in, the story unraveling in unexpected ways. She had thought she was stepping into a confrontation between two people, one woman and one stranger. But now she understood there was more at play. This wasn't just about her. This wasn't just about what had happened in the park. The mother's gaze hardened. "Oh, I know exactly who you are," she said, her voice unflinching. "And I know what you've been hiding." In that moment, the man's face cracked. His eyes flickered with something. Was it fear? Regret? Or was it the weight of something he had been carrying for too long? Before anyone could react, the mother moved quickly, a blur of motion. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope. The man's eyes widened when he saw it, and he instinctively took a step back, like a cornered animal. "You thought you could run," the mother said, her tone cold and precise. But we've got everything. The woman watched, transfixed, as the mother held the envelope out toward the man. The man's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief as he stared at it, his face paling. You think I won't go public with this? The mother asked, her voice steady, almost too calm. Think again. I will make sure everyone knows. Everything. The man stood frozen for a moment, his breath shallow, his body tense. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and it looked like he was about to speak, to argue, but no words came. The woman could see it in his eyes. The walls were crumbling, the secrets he had been holding so tightly were about to break free. The man opened his mouth, but then, as if a final realization hit him, he closed it again. There was no more fight left in him. The truth had come for him, and it wasn't something he could outrun anymore. The woman's head spun. The tension that had been building for so long, the hidden connections between the people in front of her, it all started to click into place. She realized now, this wasn't a random encounter. This wasn't just about one confrontation. The woman and the man had histories tied together, histories that had finally come to a head. The mother, too, was tied into all of it. But just as the air seemed to settle, just as the final revelation felt like it was about to come crashing down, something unexpected happened. The mother suddenly collapsed to her knees, her face pale, her body trembling. For a moment, the woman thought it was a trick, some move to keep the upper hand. But the truth hit her like a slap in the face as she saw the mother's hand reach toward her chest, as if searching for something before she gasped for breath, her hand going limp. The woman's blood ran cold as she rushed forward, reaching out to steady the mother's shaking body. What? What's happening? The woman asked, her voice trembling as she knelt beside her. The mother couldn't answer. Her eyes were unfocused, and her breathing was ragged. It wasn't until the woman turned her gaze to the envelope in her hand that she realized what had happened. The envelope. The one that held the truth. It wasn't just any envelope. It had been holding something more, something that had already begun to take its toll. Is she? The woman started, her voice barely a whisper. The man, his anger forgotten, stepped back, his face a mixture of guilt and something else, something she couldn't quite read. His eyes met the woman's, and for a fleeting moment she saw a deep regret there. I didn't mean for this to happen, he muttered, his voice strained. But the woman didn't hear him. She was too focused on the mother, who was now gasping, barely able to breathe, her body shaking uncontrollably. Someone call an ambulance! The woman shouted, panic rising in her chest. She could barely think straight, the world around her turning into a blur as everything she thought she understood about the situation shattered in an instant. As she tried to support the mother, she realized the weight of it all. The secrets, the lies, the betrayal, it had all been building toward this moment. The consequences of their actions, the hidden truths they had tried to bury for so long, were finally catching up with them. And just as the woman turned to look for help, her eyes landed on the man, standing there with a haunted expression. He wasn't even looking at the mother anymore. He was looking at her deeply, searchingly, as if he had just realized something. Before she could ask what it was, his words hit her like a lightning bolt. You don't know the full story, he said, his voice shaking. None of you do. The woman's heart stopped. The truth had always been more elusive than she had realized. And now, it seemed, it was slipping through her fingers once again. The man's words lingered in the air, thick and heavy, almost suffocating the space between them. The woman's mind raced as she looked at him, trying to process what he had just said. You don't know the full story, he repeated, his voice quieter now, almost defeated. There was something in his eyes, something that spoke of regret, of guilt, but also of fear. The woman felt a rush of emotion, a storm of confusion, anger, and disbelief. Everything had been building to this moment, and yet it felt like the ground beneath her was shifting, like the truth she thought she had in her hands was slipping away. She glanced back at the mother, still trembling on the ground, her breath ragged and shallow. The woman's chest tightened with fear. What had just happened? Was it too late to save her? Before she could respond, the sound of sirens cut through the air, growing louder as they approached. Relief washed over the woman in a brief, fleeting moment, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of urgency. She needed answers. The questions were piling up faster than she could keep track of them. What was really going on here? Why was the man so involved? And what had the mother been hiding? The man stepped forward, his face now a mask of resignation. He glanced at the woman, then at the mother. His eyes were full of shame, but there was something else in them too, something that made the woman's stomach tighten with unease. "You think you understand," he said, his voice barely audible over the rising wail of the sirens. "But you don't. You don't understand any of this." The woman shook her head, feeling the weight of his words as they hung in the air. She wasn't sure if he was speaking to her, or if he was speaking to himself. But before she could ask him to explain, the paramedics arrived, rushing past her to tend to the mother. One of the medics knelt beside the woman, quickly assessing her condition. The woman stepped aside, her heart hammering in her chest as the paramedics worked to stabilize her. She was dimly aware of the man still standing there, watching them with a distant, almost haunted expression. The paramedics moved with practiced efficiency, securing the mother on a stretcher and preparing to transport her. The woman watched them, her mind still spinning, the mystery deepening with every passing second. There was something she didn't know. Something crucial that had been left unsaid. "Who are you?" the woman asked again, turning her gaze back to the man, her voice tinged with frustration. "What's really going on here?" The man didn't immediately respond. He seemed lost in thought, his eyes distant, and for a moment, the woman almost thought he wasn't going to answer. But then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said, almost apologetically. "None of us did." The woman's heart skipped a beat. There was something in his tone, a vulnerability she hadn't expected. He wasn't just a threat or an antagonist, he was a part of something much bigger, something she couldn't yet understand. The paramedics began to lift the mother onto the stretcher, and the woman instinctively moved to follow, but the man's voice stopped her. "Wait," he said. "You need to know something. Something about her. About what happened." The woman turned back to him, her breath shallow, her mind racing. This was the moment. The moment when the truth was finally going to come to light. The man took a deep breath, as though gathering the strength to speak. His gaze flickered toward the mother, now being loaded into the ambulance, then back to the woman. He hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he said. The mother, she had no idea. She never knew what was really at stake. The woman's heart pounded in her chest. She had no idea what he meant by that. What had the mother been involved in? What had she not known? "I don't know how it started," the man continued, his voice trembling now. "But she was connected to something. Something dangerous. Something that should have stayed buried. And I tried to protect her from it. I thought if I kept her away, kept her out of it, she'd be safe. But the truth is, it was never going to stay hidden forever." The woman's mind reeled, trying to make sense of his words. The mother had been connected to something dangerous? What was he talking about? Was this all tied to the confrontation at the park? To the racist comments? Or was there something more, something far more complicated at play? "You don't understand," the man said again, his voice softer now, filled with a mixture of sorrow and regret. "The things she's been running from. The things we've all been running from. They've caught up with us. And now it's too late." The ambulance doors slammed shut, and the vehicle pulled away, sirens blaring into the distance. The woman stood there, stunned, her body numb as the man's words echoed in her mind. It wasn't just about the park. It wasn't just about the incident that had sparked everything. There was something deeper, something hidden that she didn't yet fully grasp. "I need to know what happened," the woman said, her voice steady now, though her hands were shaking. "Tell me everything." The man met her gaze, his face filled with a weariness she hadn't seen before. He seemed torn, as though he didn't want to reveal the truth, but he knew, deep down, that he had no choice. "The truth is," he began slowly, "the mother, she was involved in something much bigger than any of us realized. It all started a long time ago, before she even knew who she really was." The woman's mind raced as the man spoke, trying to piece together the fragments of a story she hadn't even known existed. The mother, the man, the park incident, it was all connected, but the connections were buried deep. Deeper than she could have ever imagined. She wasn't just some random person, the man continued. She was part of something. Something secret. Something that goes back generations. A network of people. People who made decisions, people who controlled things. And she didn't even know. She was just a pawn in a game that was already in motion. The woman's head spun. The puzzle pieces were starting to fall into place, but they didn't make sense. She couldn't fully comprehend what the man was saying. But she knew one thing for certain: the truth, whatever it was darker and more complicated than anything she had ever expected. "Why didn't you tell her?" the woman asked, her voice shaking with disbelief. "Why keep her in the dark?" "I tried," the man said, his voice heavy with regret. "But she didn't want to hear it. She wanted to live a normal life, to forget everything. And I thought I could protect her from it. I thought if I kept her away, kept her safe, she wouldn't have to face it. But now, it's all coming to the surface, and there's no stopping it." The woman could see the guilt written all over his face. He had been part of something bigger than he could control, and now it was all unraveling. The mother, the man, they had been caught in a web of lies, secrets, and betrayal. And the woman, unwittingly, had become a part of it too. The tension in the air was palpable as the woman stood there, trying to absorb the enormity of what had just been revealed. The park incident, the confrontation, the hidden truths, it had all been building up to this moment, and now the truth was out. But the question remained: what would happen next? "I didn't want you involved," the man said, his voice almost pleading now. "But now that you know, now that it's all out in the open, there's no going back." The woman's mind was racing. What did all of this mean for her? What did it mean for the mother, for the man, for everyone involved? There were still so many unanswered questions, so many unknowns. "I don't know what's going to happen next," the woman said quietly, her voice filled with uncertainty. "But I do know one thing. The truth is finally out. And no matter what comes next, we all have to face it." The man didn't respond. He just stood there, his face a mixture of relief and sorrow. The truth was out, but the consequences of that truth were still unfolding. As the woman turned to leave, her thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. The mystery had been solved, but in some ways, it had only opened the door to even deeper questions. The story wasn't over yet. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with unknowns, but one thing was clear: the truth had a way of revealing itself, whether they were ready for it or not. And now, they all had to live with the consequences.